I grew up with the neo-atheist movement being a big deal. People like Richard Dawkins, they were on the television all the time. And so I remember as a young child, like watching and consuming, these documentaries.
Canada has low levels of government restrictions on religion. If you do not agree as a charitable organization with other social programs, including abortion rights, then you will lose your charitable status. Would you say you experienced some kind of supernatural healing?
Religion is just a delusion.
Over 30% of Canadians today say they do not believe in God, and that number is growing. We live in a country where faith often feels outdated, dismissed, or simply irrelevant. But what happens when someone who grew up in that world, who called herself an atheist, but decides to pray anyway? In this episode, Kiri Jane Erb shares how a moment of raw desperation opened the door she never expected, and what followed after changed everything.
Your profile actually says you're a speaker with Apologetics Canada. It says also that you have a background in politics, in political science, and in theological studies. Explain that a little more, actually.
Yeah, my undergrad is politics and international relations. So I studied that mostly in England, but with a year at McGill in Quebec, in Montreal, which was really fun. It was actually during that time that I really encountered Jesus for the first time. And actually my faith became real to me. In terms of my theological studies, as a slightly more mature student, I went back to university, finally kind of figured out what I actually really wanted to study. Like I really like the politics and IR stuff, but at the same time, was like, I really want to figure out how my faith intertwines with this. Like, where does the rubber hit the road, all this kind of stuff. And so that's when I studied systematic and philosophical theology at Nottingham in the UK, at distance, that one.
You have a background in political science, you went into theological studies, and you became a believer while you were doing your studies in political science, is it?
Yeah, 100%.
Strange.
Well, and more strange because like Montreal and Quebec especially is not seen as like a hotspot for religious faith or belief, right? In fact, it's like quite the opposite. I think it's like less than 1% or something believe in Christianity there. It actually came off the back of my first year of university in England, where I'd hit this massive wall where everything in my life had like culminated to like, okay, finally get to university, get to study this thing, get to kind of spread my wings. And then I faced an intense season of depression and pain and anxiety and all of that stuff. Like I didn't grow up in a Christian household, but I've called myself a believer for a while. I need to pray about this. And it's not something that I'd really had the habit of doing because I think on some level I'd felt connected to God, but I don't think I'd activated that side of my faith when the rubber hits the road in that sort of way. And looking back, just a really raw, honest prayer session that I had, reaching out, crying to Jesus, being like, God, like, what's going on? I've got no idea. I'm struggling. Change things. Looking back, he did. I think a big element of that was he opened the door for me to study in Quebec, in McGill. And that's where I encountered some other people of faith, but also encountered Jesus, I believe, God, in a really tangible way. And so I would credit him for turning my world upside down, inside out, and for bringing me out of that, like, despair, mental torture, all of that kind of stuff. So did it have anything to do with the place? It's probably despite of the place in a ways. But isn't that so Jesus? Like, I think God so often does the opposite of what we expect him to do.
All right. So how come you not having a reference point for faith, especially the Christian faith, you knew to pray to Jesus?
So I grew up in England, in the southwest of England, level with London before you get to Wales. It was already kind of seen a bit as a post-Christian culture. I think the England is, in a way, is culturally about 20 years, I would say, like in advance of what generally happens here in Canada, which is very, very interesting in terms of cultural shift and movements. And so I grew up with the neo-atheist movement being a big deal. So people like Richard Dawkins were very, they were on the television all the time. And so I remember as a young child, like watching and consuming, these documentaries which I didn't really realize, were coming from that angle, basically saying, religion is just a delusion, right? God is a delusion and there's like nothing to it and you're ridiculous if you believe this. And of course, like we're just dancing DNA. Right. So that's what was informing kind of my mind, my worldview at that initial stage. Even in my physical space, there was like books like that my mom was reading on the kitchen table, right? Saying God is a delusion. But it was when I was about 11 that I started to feel inside of myself like this internal like prompt. Like I had no idea what it was at the time, but looking back, I would say, you know, that must have been the Holy Spirit from the Christian perspective. I was into running. I love my dog. Every time I walked past a church, even if it was a dying church, right? I felt like this compulsion. I need to go in. It wasn't because friends were doing it. It wasn't anything like that. It was just this very raw encounter and just this compulsion. Yeah, that in some way I needed to be there. And so my mom was an atheist. She was like, well, I'm not taking you, right? You can do that yourself if you have to. But so basically I started taking myself to the local village church. And it was a very, what we'd call like a high church, kind of Anglican, Church of England church. Really funny because I didn't appreciate it at the time, but now realize it was like 1,000-year-old Norman church with like amazing peeling paintings on the side and like graves under it. It was like super old school UK like church. You sat in the pews and didn't really know what to expect. And again, didn't really have words for things, but knew that it was right to be there in some way. And I remember just even the rhythm of communion, like learning liturgy, seeing the rhythms and declarations of faith there, but then realizing like, oh, like I feel different after I've taken communion. I feel cleaner in some way. I feel different in some way. I don't know what it is. I have no idea why, but something shifts. And not like a night to day shift, but like there was something that changed, right? In this deep place that I can't reach to myself, like deeper inside of myself. It was like, oh, that's interesting. That became a rhythm in my life from about the age of 11. I was baptized, like confirmed. But then before going to university, I think as it does for many people, that rhythm started to become more of a chore. Because I think some of that initial kind of like first love, I still felt those same things. I still knew there was some sort of truth in it. I'm starting to do these things because I feel like I expect to do them because I'm a young person in a church of mostly old people. And so I started to kind of step back a little bit and kind of lost my first love in a ways in terms of faith. By the time I got to university, I wasn't like, you know, I would have called myself a Christian, but also wasn't really practicing that much. Like I had a soft spot for that because I knew some way my heart's been touched, but at the same time, like I wasn't living for Jesus in a way that I know now is possible. And it was after then that period of depression, hitting rock bottom, where like everything was like stripped away from me, like my health, status, friends, like literally anything you build your life on, right? That we all try to accumulate. All of that was like ripped away. An example of that, like I ran my first kind of marathon distance when I was 11. And so I placed a lot of trust in my body, how far I could push it, like the distance, all that kind of stuff. And I pushed my mind as well. And so if, you know, people who might be familiar with like a, you know, Harry Potter-esque kind of thing, you have like, you know, houses and head girls and all that kind of stuff. And I went to a very, you know, blazer tie, like interesting British school, kind of like that. And essentially I got my dream. I got the best results. I was head girl and I like kind of represented the school. So I'd kind of reached that and was ready to spread my wings for university. It was in that place then that all of that, like false hope, trust in myself that I'd built kind of started to erode and reveal itself for what it was. Not those things are bad, that I can't place, they're not robust enough to build an actual life on. They can't stand the test of time. So as I mentioned before, I would have run kind of marathon distances. I used to train on hills. I lived by the Cotswold Hills in England, really beautiful kind of rolling hills. Then as my health started to decline, I really struggled to run between two lampposts without it feeling like just an impossible feat, an impossible task. And I was in that space of all that being eroded, kind of realizing like, what am I meant to reach out to, right? Where do I place my hope, my trust, my future? This is meant to be the best time of my life. I'm now at university. Finally, I'm free. I can do whatever I want. And then being like, but I'm not free, right? I'm struggling. Right. I'm falling apart. And yeah, and so it's in that place that kind of realization, like, you would have called yourself a Christian. Like, is this real or is this not real? And so hence kind of reaching out and looking back, I do believe that's like a really pivotal kind of time and space in my life, being like, okay, Jesus, if you're real, if you are really honestly real and true, then show yourself. So I was talking about Easter, right? He's meant to be the resurrection God. I'm feeling like I'm literally dying here. Like I'd push my body really hard and now I can't push it at all. Like I feel like I'm literally falling to pieces. And, you know, if God, if you are who you say you are, show me. Because if you've got, you should be able to.
So what happened after? Would you say you experienced some kind of supernatural healing?
Like in that moment, I think it was just a really raw, honest kind of like, okay, like there's a piece there, but it was good. I wouldn't say there was a supernatural healing kind of in that moment, but over time my body like healed from many things, some of which I probably can't even, say on a public platform. I think what it did, if I'm truly honest, was it ignited something or even fanned a flame that had begun in my life, but kind of, put the gas on that. And then when I was at McGill, started to meet kind of Christians, and I was still questioning, do I even want to be involved with this? Like, I don't know. Like, yes, but no. I had this real tug of war with God. They invited me to this weekend away, and it was by Lake Ontario. And I just remember being again like, okay, God, like, I've started to pray, started to reach out to you. You've started to do some things in my life, but like, enough for me to tell people about you, enough for me to actually place my life on you. Basically, in a weekend away, surrounded by other people for whom this was probably just completely normal. Like, people started to sing praises, all this kind of stuff. And like, I'd not experienced some songs or forms of worship before, being from a more traditional church. And there were some declarations and those kind of things, just normal, average church things looking back. But I just remember just utterly breaking down, like utterly being a mess, as if like, okay, now the floodgates are like broken. There was some like almost like a rupture, like this built up pressure kind of ruptured. It was almost like the pain, the tension, all of that stuff kind of came out in a ways, in a ball of mess, right? Like in tears and all that kind of raw stuff. And I think, everyone else was totally fine, just happy doing that thing. But I'm like, yeah. And looking back, like in that moment, it was like my world turned inside out. Yes, I'd called Jesus Lord before, but it's now like he'd taken my entire world and all the contours of it like was still there. For example, like a globe, take a globe, and you have like the green is the land and the blue is the ocean, and it was like he like completely and utterly inverted it. The contours were still there, so I'm still me, there's still my story, but now like the ocean's green and the land is blue, is like, he's inverted their priorities, ignited something truly and utterly different. And my life's never been the same, honestly. I think, I don't know if that explains enough kind of that.
Right. I think it's fine to say that your healing is actually more of an inside out sort of healing, right?
100%. I think Christianity is fascinating in this regards, because on the one hand, what Jesus does is for the healing of the world. It's for the world to be changed, transformed, infused with his love, with his goodness, with his hope, and a hope that has traction. But on another level, some of that is achieved, and most is achieved from the inside out of God's people. And so like for me, even personally, the physical healing, but also the emotional healing from trauma, all that kind of stuff, which actually was part of my master's dissertation, I think was like an inside out work, which I think is a fascinating one. So here's one insight there. Trauma and traumatology is a big conversation within the church, within even like socio-political kind of realm, right? How do we deal with the mental health crisis? And what I think is fascinating is that some of the definitions of trauma that we can look at essentially means that you have death interrupting life. You have in some way a close brush with death, or a loss or a death of a dream, whatever it may be, something really significant has ruptured and interrupted the flow of life. So death interrupts life. What you actually have in the Christian message with Jesus is that there's a recognition that the world is ruptured, the world is fallen, the world is not okay, and we're not okay, right? Therefore life interrupts the reign of death to change it, to invert it, to change everything. And that's the game changer.
So let me come from a pessimistic point of view here. So what you're talking about is when life is ongoing on a normal day, and then you have a sort of death, which is a destabilization of regular living, maybe trauma, maybe some kind of pain and whatever that happens in life. And then you say the Christian message actually is that Christ comes into that and infuses life into it. Now let's take a few steps back. Let's talk about the Easter season. The Easter season is actually the death of a sinless man who came to reconcile the world back to God. But if the world was dead and then the sinless man comes through death as well, is that now multiplication of death?
So I think what you have with Jesus is a recognition from God himself that death is a problem. Right? The whole message of scripture, you could say, is God's response to death, evil, suffering. That's why it starts with good creation, but right away in Genesis 3, everything is utterly ripped at the seams. And so what you have in Jesus is, even from Genesis 3 itself, a promise that somebody, the seed of a woman, Jesus, born of Mary, like would essentially like come and like deal with and defeat like death head on. So I guess the first point there is that the Christian message isn't a, ignoring death. It's the decision to the adamant, earth-shaking decision for God to enter into creation to defeat death head on. What he does, so that it's not a multiplication, but instead an engaging with, is that he essentially engages with what's causing that living death within us and within our world in order to defeat it. So let me take a step back really quickly. One of my friends, Glenn Scrivener, I think he kind of articulates this really, really well. So I'd like to just kind of lay out the landscape. So the idea is that, in the beginning, there's light, life, and love, right? But the world's not like that. I know the world's not like that. So instead of light, so often we find darkness. Instead of life, we find death, right? Instead of love, we find disconnection. And I find that piece actually most interesting, something that I hopefully we'll circle back to later. That's exactly what you see throughout scripture, including in Genesis 3, this world ripped at the seams. So what Jesus does is he says, you in my darkness, right? Do you want my light, right? You in death, right? Do you want my life? You in disconnection, do you want my love? He doesn't leave the beloved at a distance. God enters into time to engage with those things. Because that darkness, death, and disconnection, what that does to us as people is it keeps us enslaved to ways of being or trying to be in a world disconnected from the one who is life. Because if we're trying to live disconnected from the one who is life, that feels like death, right? We feel like we have to establish ourselves. We have to try to provide for ourselves that foundation for living. That's what I did as a young person. And I think it's really what we all do to cope with the fact that we're thrown into this world, right? And we know it's not okay, right? It's struggling. It's not okay. And so when Jesus enters in, what he does is by he engages, I guess, with the darkness, death, and disconnection, the ways that we've tried to deal with that and yet kept ourselves more enslaved. So, for example, if we're struggling in death, darkness, and disconnection, we're going to start to try to do stuff that we think is going to help, but actually really, really doesn't. So that's where sin comes in. And that's where when we sin, it means that we actually feel so much shame. And that compounds that feeling of death, darkness, disconnection. We want to hide. We want to cover ourselves. We want to try to get ourselves out of this pit. What happens here is the recognition in Jesus that we can't get ourselves out of this place of feeling stuck, like enslaved, under siege. Actually, the Greek for good news is euangelion. What that means essentially in the time and culture of the New Testament is your righteous king has come and broken the siege. So that siege looks like that death, darkness, disconnection, and all the shame and the sin that we've built up as we try to get ourselves out of that place. And he's like, okay, you can't get yourself out of that place, but I can excavate that. I can get you out of that place. Let's remove the shame. Let me pay for that. Let me deal with that, right? So that you can then live. So by dying on the cross, what happens there is that God himself, as you said, like a sinless man, takes upon himself the sin of the world in order that it might be dealt with. If God is love, he can't just say, sin doesn't matter, because it essentially means you're not upholding the worth of another person. And if God is love, he can't be okay with that. And so he has to have a way in order to take us out from being under siege, to free us. He has to have a way to recognize that sin is sin, to deal with that in order to get it out of the way and allow us to enter into grace. So by dying on the cross, he pays for that sin so that we can be free from that. The idea in Romans, Paul kind of articulates this. There's a lot more to this, but he basically says, we, by giving kind of Jesus our sin, we do that by also dying with him so that we can also be raised with him. So it's not that Jesus does this entirely disconnected from us. Like, hey, just throw me all your stuff that's keeping you stuck. What's happening here is that in time, God is engaged engage with humanity in such a way as to make a way when there was no way, to take us from being stuck under siege to being free. And through the Holy Spirit today, we can join ourselves to Jesus' death, giving him our pain and our shame, dying with him so that we can also be raised with him. What this means is that it's not just Jesus who goes from death to life. The message of the gospel is you can also go from death to life, into new life, to be a new creation with Christ, so that you are no longer stuck or no longer have to be stuck in those same patterns that kept you enslaved. Instead, you can be free. Instead of living in death, darkness, and disconnection, you can now receive the love, light, and life of Jesus, not as a slave or as a, out of duty, doing something for God and proving how good you are, but instead being given this free gift, which is a beautiful and I think a powerful way of seeing life change.
That's a little Easter sermon that you just gave there, actually.
There's lots more, I'm sorry.
Yeah, definitely. Which I think that's a very beautiful description of the death and the essence of that death. But let's take a few steps back here. You referenced the book of Genesis chapter 3, Genesis chapter 1, God made the heavens and the earth. Chapter 2, and man was saddled with the responsibility to name everything that God had made. Chapter 3, man falls. Sin was introduced into humanity. On a tangent here, one of the things that frustrated me a lot growing up as a young guy, which it frustrates me less than in the past, maybe it doesn't even frustrate me like before anymore, was the fact that the biblical documentary of the life of men prior to sin is not significant. It's almost like da-da-da-da-da-da, and everything just breaks. And the entirety of the Bible, from Genesis chapter 3 until Revelation, is actually post-fall experience. So, a lot of times I try to wonder, what did men look like prior to the fall? You think about everything about humans now, almost everything about our lives is actually in reference to the fall or to death. When you're talking about the day and night, for instance, it's actually with reference to death most times, because, your time is limited on earth. You better do what you got to do in time because you're going to die someday, right? And when I look at other things, even in life, being an engineer, almost everything in math, almost everything in science is with respect to time. And I would wonder, God made everything in time, but here is a God who dwells outside of time. And that will frustrate me a lot, back then, that how can I understand life? One, outside of those two parameters, outside of time and outside of sin and death, which is very interesting, a topic. It almost sounds like a master's or a doctorate thesis on its own. But now to compound that thesis is the fact that right after Genesis chapter 3, the earth just goes into this chaos. Man was driven out of the garden, and then God puts this cherubim to guard the way to the tree of life. And right after then, God clothes man with the skin of an animal instead of the fig that they made for themselves. And since that time, the issue of blood and life never ceased throughout the entirety of the Bible. In fact, as you read on from Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, even until Joshua, until even the later days in the Old Testament, until Malachi, you constantly see blood and life. And then you come into the New Testament, the letters of the apostles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, with the Gospels. You find also quickly a sinless man is sacrificed. Again, it's blood. The question I wrote to you earlier on, it's the reason I asked that question. What's it about this Christian faith and blood? And what's the technology in blood that actually covers, that wipes away sins as the Bible claims it does?
That's a
lot of questions.
It is a lot. Yeah. Okay. So I think in terms of your blood kind of question, I think straight away from the Old Testament, blood is incredibly significant. As you say, like as soon as there is the fall in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve are clothed when they leave the garden. The idea there is that, if somebody was to be disinherited at that time in the early Jewish kind of culture, in the Israelite culture, they would have taken away everything. What you have there is a picture of God giving them something back. He's covering them. He's basically saying, this has disconnected relationship, but actually I'm still providing for you. He's saying, I'm going to do something, and that something is foreshadowing what Jesus would do. So the sacrifice of the animals there, for example, in order to have any sort of like clothes made of skin, right, points forward to the sacrifice of Jesus in the same way that today we can point back, and it's still powerful, to what Jesus did, and then to have that powerful kind of in our own lives. And so what you're saying there is, your question was what's so kind of, significant about blood. Blood, the Bible says, is essentially connected with life. It's a symbol of life. Blood flowing through your veins is what allows you to stay alive. And yet, the human world was so inverted, as you say, from the beginning there in Genesis 3, that as soon as the fall happens, and they're even covered, and God's kind of helping them out a little bit, there's a murder right away in the Holy Family, right? You have like Cain killing Abel, his brother, and even God warns, sin's crouching at the door, right? You don't do this thing. And then actually the blood of Abel cries out like from the ground. There's this idea, this connection there between blood and life that's so intensive. And I think that from our current cultural eyes and perspective, we can see that, or I guess we approach that reading in how it's often used today, right? We often like sanitize our world, and we don't think about blood, and we don't like to think about what keeps us alive. We'd rather keep that behind a curtain in the hospital. We often don't think about death, right? We try not to think about death because it's painful and it's triggering. We don't know what to do with it. And yet the original connection there is life equals blood. When life is, pours out of veins, right? That's when that therefore equals death. And so there's actually this motif that happens throughout the Old Testament whereby things to do with life are said to be clean, things to do with death is unclean. That's where that kind of dynamic kind of happens with all these laws and things that connected to a method of worship called the tabernacle, which happens kind of early on. And I think connecting that, you're saying the mechanism for us, right? I think connecting that, the idea is that life has fundamentally changed. As we've said, it's for the worse, much, much for the worse. The human heart has actually inverted and shifted. The whole dynamic and the process has changed so that before we're created in the image of God. We still have those fingerprints kind of over us. We're still created well, right? Regardless of who we are, where we've come from, what we believe. We're still made well. And yet, in being disconnected from the one who is life, the way in which we live has changed. And especially at that place of love and affections and desire, because I think ultimately that's being connected to the one who is love is the biggest, I guess being disconnected now is the biggest frustration and change that has happened in that respect. What that means is that the human heart, instead of being outward orientated, loving others in the way that it should be, like God, I'll maybe circle back around to why that is later, but instead it's essentially impoverished because it's missing that love from God and is instead turned in towards itself. So the dynamics of human life are utterly changed. The Latin word there would be homo incurvatus in se, which means humankind, mankind turned in upon himself. What this actually means is that in our, we still, in our lives, we still try to love, we still try to do good things, we still feel like, we should be doing these things, and yet ultimately kind of comes around in this hurting, painful, dry world that's so impoverished from love, we start to get a bit desperate and we hurt each other. And actually, it's that hurt that can cause, violence within our world. I think, at least initially, people don't wake up and be like, today I'm going to be violent, right? Generally, we end up hurting others because, as most people say, we're hurt. But generally, we try to go in the world, engaging in a somewhat positive way, almost being betrayed by our affections and end up hurting others. And then as we become more desperate, cycles continue, which then both personally but also communally can end up looking like violence then leading to the shedding of blood. And so what you have with Jesus then is this fascinating picture whereby you have not God holding Jesus there, like not God the Father holding Jesus there. Jesus has chosen to give of his life in a way that he knows means his blood is going to be pouring out. His blood is going to be spilled. He is crucified by the religious authorities, by Rome, which is probably, one of the most violent, right? The pinnacle of violence with kind of in the world. And so I think we have this convergence of pictures whereby Jesus is giving of his life. He doesn't have to go to the cross. He's saying, I am going to go to the cross to deal with, to pay for, the sin and the shame and all that kind of stuff by allowing violence, this culture of violence, to do its worst. And yet, as it does its worst, I'm going to invert that and give my life. So Rome is taking life, Jesus is giving life. And so it's actually the pouring of his blood that reorientates the possibility for humanity to be changed. When we connect with Jesus, what can happen is that our lives too can resynchronize, we essentially become a new creation, so that our hearts click back into how they were meant to function, that we can love in a new way. So Jesus' life wasn't taken in a ways, it was given. He chose to pour out his life, and that pouring out changes the ways that we live and our heart affections can function.
Let me go on a little detour here.
Oh.
Quickly, what was your master's about again? You referenced it earlier on.
Yeah, it's systematic and philosophical theology. So the philosophy part is definitely something that I really appreciate, the thinking deeply about, these questions and how does that actually matter.
Right. So essentially it's a philosophical way of answering the Christian faith and Christian worldview.
I'd say, engaged with the philosophical discussion. So essentially, how does the Christian message engage with how humans have tried to think about this, and how do we give words to something that is potentially beyond even our ability to fully comprehend, and yet as humans we really want to try, right? And I think that's part of the battle.
I'm certain you're enjoying this conversation right now and you can't wait to get back into it. But permit me to hold you for a second here. More than 95% of the viewers on the channel haven't subscribed yet, and it goes a long way in helping the channel. But if you can click on the subscribe button right now, it will go a long way in helping to improve the quality of the work on the channel and the quality of guests that you see on this channel every time. Please do me that favor, click on the subscribe button. I want to achieve 20% subscriber to viewer count this time.
I think one of the questions that often come to mind, I was chatting with someone on the podcast about this just a few days ago as well. One of the questions that come to mind often is, how do you respond to death? I've experienced the loss of a loved one before, especially after my mom passed just a few years ago. I never actually thought about death that deeply up until that moment. My response to it was kind of at first strange. Of course, I was responding deep from within my heart. I didn't let the experience take over my life, for sure. But, let me just cite one example, for instance. One of the weird things that happened after my mom passed, for instance, was a few months after. I remember I was trying to remember, conversations that we had. I found myself that I was constantly struggling to remember what she looked like. That was very strange to me. And I remember Googling it after a while, that I really struggled to remember what she looked like. And every time I would go back to my phone, check her photos and say, oh, that's what she looked like. And I Googled it. Is this normal or something wrong with me? And I realized that's part of it's a part of people's experiences when they lose loved ones. Sometimes some people struggle to remember what their faces look like. That didn't last long. Of course, I remember what she looks like now. But I think that was part of my mind also dealing with that tragedy. Mm-hmm. But I think the issue about Jesus' death, sometimes the way we interact with this is what actually frustrates the mind. One, you interact with it on the basis of, how can a good God kill a good son? How can a sinful world deserve the death of a good man that lived? And, you look at all of that, one of the very important things that came to my mind of late about the Christian faith is actually the fact that compared to any other religion, I don't know of any, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, I don't know of any other religion where the deity in that religion died for the followers. I don't remember Allah dying for the cause of Islam, as it were. I don't remember Buddha dying for the people. It's actually each individual kind of trying to walk their way into the favor of God. And I think that distinguishes the Christian faith totally, in that you're not, that initial walking your way towards the favor of God is actually paved for by this sacrifice that's actually equal in magnitude and proportion to the sin of the first man. But the question is, sometimes we respond to the death of Christ out of morality debate. Why would this God? If he was good, why this? But maybe the way to respond to it sometimes is actually to question, if it was that important to a good God that a good son should die, what's inherently good in it for me? I don't know if you would agree with that and what you think generally about the question of morality of death and the morality of a good God versus a sinful world.
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I think you
Mm.
hit on so many like amazing like topics
Ideas.
to go so
Right.
so deep into. Like I can resonate 100% with the experience of losing a loved one. Sorry. Yeah, my dad went through a long period of like struggling with cancer before he passed away. That was over 10 years ago now. But I think what that did to me was it created this existential itch, right? It's like, okay, I know that God, you've carried me through this season. Like, what does this mean? How does my faith actually respond to questions of losing a loved one, evil, suffering, kind of all of that? I'd love, even if you could just rephrase your question really quickly so I can get to exactly what you want me to address.
So maybe the way to put it actually is, how do you respond to such an experience from the perspective of your faith? And if you compare that with a good God that died, is there a way that we respond to such experience that we could also respond to the death of Jesus? Do we respond to them equally? How did you bounce back? How did faith help you bouncing back from your experience? And is that equal to how we respond to the death of Jesus?
Is there something kind of different about the death of Jesus? I think what the death of Jesus does, and I say that like really lightly because I think when we approach the cross, it's so easy to take one kind of slice or one trajectory through that's the magnitude of what happened, almost like it's a diamond and we're just seeing like one face of it. I think there's a real case to be made that the death, crucifixion and resurrection and ascension of Jesus, like all the Easter stuff, right, is all the stuff that Jesus did is almost like this done with multiple faces, and that there's many ways to slice and engage with this. And so on one hand, there's the very kind of the lived experience way in terms of my human response to death, and how having a savior who has died helps you understand like that God understands, right? He's there, like he went and experienced that. I think that is helpful. So that's the human side of things. Then there's a side of like how he engages kind of with that, how his life and death creates a way when there wasn't a way for us to get out of our own death and resurrect, but also like our own depression and resurrect, our own disorientation and resurrect, our own trauma and resurrect. I think especially when you lose a loved one, it can set you into this massive tailspin, right? As I've said, especially with traumatic experiences, it's that how do I live on when like the rub of death has been so utterly close? And I think Jesus can become this incredible guide both through life but also in our interior kind of landscapes of our hearts, in order to figure out like how can we live on. The reality is that I think while friends can only get so close, or counselors can only speak to the heart and mind to a certain depth, the Spirit of God can meet us in an interior place that nothing else can. Some of my master's thesis was on trauma, time, and theology, how those things go together. And so in my response here, I'm pulling on certain like non-Christian psychologists, for example, Thomas Fuchs. His idea is that when we are disorientated, when we experience trauma, really, there's disorientation that he says actually looks like a desynchronization with the world around us. And so healing, therefore, must necessitate a resynchronization. And so what I find really interesting about that is, okay, so resynchronizing to what? Like how? For example, it's really hard to resynchronize to a culture that is confused, that is like doesn't know what it is. It doesn't have one goal, that is massive voices all pulling in completely, utterly different directions, full of different rhythms and different ways, the trajectories of life. Instead, I would argue that there's something really powerful to the case that through the Holy Spirit, what God can do is offer an ability to be resynchronized to the rhythm of heaven, who God is, almost like hearing his heartbeat and having that kind of resuscitate us so that we can resurrect in a way that actually, isn't necessarily that nothing else can do for us. That even in our darkest night of the soul, our biggest isolation, utterly disorientated and disconnected, God can still engage with our hearts and resurrect from the inside out.
Right. And I think actually, just to chime in on some of the thoughts you shared there, when people ask the question about the morality of death, and even the morality of a good God putting a good son through the most gruesome death ever, like you said, it's actually one slice of the story.
Right.
The complete story, actually, which I love the fact that, apart from the Bible as a historical document, if you look at the Bible through that lens, there are other documents that corroborate that story, that actually this man in history died.
Yes.
But he didn't actually only die, because I think if Jesus died and, that was it, and he was dumped in the grave and his body rots there and that's the end, then I think there's nothing so spectacular about that. There are billions of people who died before him. But in this case, the complete story is actually this miraculous resurrection. And you go back to scripture, right? Is it Psalm 20 that says he knew that he would not leave his soul in Sheol. Scripture also talking about Jesus, who believed that God, his Father, would not allow his only one to see corruption.
Right.
Those kind of details in the Bible, that complete story is actually that this man was resurrected back to life, and he was actually caught up to God in heaven, to his Father, and people witnessed it. And you look at scriptural references like 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which I believe is one of the most detailed chronicles about the life and the evidential proof that Jesus actually was born, raised, died, resurrected, and ascended, and people saw him even right during ascension, and even post-resurrection, he appeared to many. I think that's a very good chronicle of that. But the complete story is that this man actually resurrected. And like you said, I think the very important thing is that in every iteration of death, while we're actually going through life, the moments of being down, being lonely, being through one of the rock bottom moments of life, there's actually a possibility of resurrection and the heart ascending back to God for each one of us. And I think that's the most fantastic part of the crucifixion, the death, the burial, the ascension of the Easter story, which is very important. And to say one more thing about that, actually, the issue about afterlife did not become so real to me until after my mom passed. I thought about it in many ways before. I believed it. I probably even taught people about it in the past. But the fact that I just lost someone I love here, am I ever going to see her again? And I remember going back to the scripture and searching again, and to realize there's actually hope for resurrection. And in fact, like you said, if anything helped me to bounce back from that experience, it was actually the fact that, one, she lived for God, and true, she really did. And I believe in the hope for resurrection. In fact, without that, I don't know how I would have dealt with that experience. And I think that's probably very close to the way you also dealt with the experience of suffering and pain when you said your father passed away from cancer. My mom passed from cancer, actually, as well. I don't know what you think about that. There's one more topic I wanted us to go into, but I'll let you chime in on that before we get into the last topic.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Yeah, as we talk about kind of the Easter story, I think there's so much beautiful evidence for that, right? It's not that it's just a good idea. It's that this truth literally touches down, right? So there's the symbolic element, which I think, Jordan Peterson and some others are doing a really good job right now, like excavating, being like, oh, there's so much here. Like Peterson will talk a lot about, sacrifice as a motif and why that matters. And so as we've been talking about, the sacrifice of Jesus, I think some of the cultural conversation that he's having right now is like, hey guys, like we all sacrifice to something, right? Even from a non-Christian, like approaching Christian maybe, right, perspective, that he's like right up to the fence there. He's recognizing that sacrifice in terms of our time, our money, what we love, right? All these things are such important human dynamics. They comprise like a human condition, right? They're the outworkings of that, and it's significant. And so as we talk about the Easter story, and as essentially the pinnacle of sacrifice, what all the other sacrifices throughout the Old Testament are like pointing towards, there's dynamics here that really matter. The reason, therefore, right, like, some people will call the Christian faith may be like archaic, right? Kind of like old, you don't need it anymore, right? You know, grown beyond that or whatever. The reason it still matters because we still have these very same heart problems. Our human condition without Jesus is still just a struggle. We can't outgrow our need for Jesus. I think even the fact that we're still talking about Jesus today, you know, while other empires have risen and fallen, and we're still talking about the resurrection today, right, is proof and evidence in itself that it changed things. It changes things significantly. It makes the way for us as humans when there was no way, where death otherwise was final, when we were completely and utterly stuck in how we even move forward in our lives, and yet cross that way through his death and resurrection that we too can follow. So I would say, yeah, it's a game changer.
Yeah, that's life transforming to even think about it. Let's talk about this last thing here. Let me just breeze through it here. Increasing numbers of adults in Canada right now have no religious affiliations. That's very known. This is according to Pew Research, actually. So Christian affiliation has declined to 55%. It used to be a lot, actually about 2/3 of Canada that had Christian affiliations before now. 4% in 1971, but it's now about 30% who identify as not religiously affiliated to anything. That's including atheists and agnostics and people who say nothing in particular about faith interests them. And other religions in Canada right now is about 8%. That's including Islam, Buddhism, Sikhism, Judaism, and Buddhism. I think that data might actually be more than that now, especially with the rise in immigration. 2/3 of Canadian adults, 64% precisely, say that religion has less important roles in their life right now than it did 20 years ago. And 29% of Canadians say that religion is important to them. Meaning, you know, it's just about 1/3 of Canadians, maybe 3 out of 10, who would say this is important to them. There's a debate also that Canada has low levels of government restrictions on religion, but I think that's debatable. I shared something with you. You know, I read this report, or actually I should call it, it's a petition that was actually started by this MP in Durham, Jamal Jibani, referencing the Finance Committee, which issued a report for an amendment to income tax recently.
Yes.
And the report precisely, let me just read it here. I've been trying to just say that offhand here. So the amendment, one of them is actually to amend the income tax to provide a definition of charity, which would remove the privileged status of advancement of religion as a charitable purpose. One of the things that Jamal Jibani recognized in this is that it's actually a threat to the Christian faith precisely. And why did he say that? Because one of the recommendations before it actually states that if you do not agree as a charitable organization with other social programs, including abortion rights, then you will lose your charitable status. So there's all of those going on right now in Canada. And I'm sure, you know, we can compare with other nations, including the UK, where you come from. And you said you grew up in the postmodern, anti-God, anti-Christian culture in the 90s.
Yep.
Actually grew up in the 90s too. When you put all of these together, on one hand, we can talk about data, culture wars, social issues, and an Easter season like we are right now. But how do you process this? And how did you as an individual, coming from such an experience in the 90s, how do you find the importance and faith so much that your heart latches onto it to pursue it?
That's a great question. I think, there's a lot happening in Canada right now. Thank you for unpicking kind of some of that. When I looked at the data myself, for the most part, it looked like most of the percentage drop in Christian affiliation, or those who identify kind of in that way, is pretty much what the growth has been in terms of those who would, identify as non-religious. So it's mostly that secular growth. It doesn't seem that statistically that a growth for other religions has, increased as a result of the Christian decrease. It basically seems statistically like a large percentage of those who were Christians, I think in the last 10 years, it's about 10%. Most of that has essentially, or seems to be the result of secularization, that they would identify as non-religious. Not that they've gone to other religions, is what I'm trying to say there.
But can I interrupt you there? Let me see how credible that is. Compare that with the rise in Islam. I know on one hand they say immigration is responsible for that, but Islam is on the rise. So is that really justifiable?
Yeah, when I was looking at the data there, I pulled up a report from Ontario. It basically, while there's, minority that are becoming Christians and a minority that are becoming Muslim, they basically said that, Islam on the rise was mostly from the result of immigration, but also larger kind of families, that kind of thing. Obviously, not exclusively. There's always lots of reasons kind of on the table there. But yeah, when I pulled up the data, I think it was really jarring to me. The rise of Islam and the decrease of Christianity do seem to be two somewhat separate issues. I haven't found any credible data, for example, for losing those who were a large population who were religiously identified as Christian to becoming Muslim, which is really interesting. And I think it speaks to something. I think what that says to me is that there's something in their inheritance, potentially, right, of a Christian faith, right? Those who are maybe growing up in Christian families are not necessarily seeing the beauty or the goodness or the worth and the value of their faith, which I think is honestly that is what I see within the churchscape as well, that people are struggling to articulate and to find the gold in that inheritance. And obviously that's not on them necessarily. I think that is a cultural part of that, is a cultural precipitate. So think of it this way: in Romans 12:2, a really common scripture is be transformed by the renewing of your mind. I think that is what Christians are called to do, to be changed, to be transformed, to be resurrection people, to therefore change the world around them. What instead I think has often happened is that the Christianity that has been presented, often in the name of, trying to make it more appealing to people, has been this kind of watered down sort of version whereby it's not be transformed by the renewal of your mind, but let's transform faith to fit with what you have in your mind. Then it's almost being transformed into, what you might kind of want it to be. But then I think
like a better version of yourself kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think in a ways, if that's part of the problem, obviously there's lots of elements, but I think if that's a current of the problem, then it is kind of quite honest of people in a ways to therefore be like, well, let's just cut out the middleman. If I don't actually believe this Christianity thing as a Christian thing, right, as substantial in itself, I need to change it to conform to the image that I want it to be, then I might as well just live my life without kind of the Christian faith, which is an honest position. Though I think more honest about that would be Jesus, because you see that actually happening, for example, even in the early church, in the book of Revelation. And, Jesus has some pretty, harsh words about a lukewarm church. The idea that, a church that has, or a faith community that has disconnected, I guess, from the real truth and life breath, of faith, and just changed it to this kind of lukewarm nothingness, right? Of course, Jesus says, I'd spit that church out of my mouth, because what's the point of it, right? So in the same way that people can walk away from that, I mean, why wouldn't they walk away from that? I think we need to do a better job of articulating, how is it Jesus can give us something different? Jesus is different. He's the game changer in our lives and communities that we cannot find anywhere else.
So I think you're attributing that to lukewarmness. It's a valid point. I was looking at the conversation that Wesley Huff had with Valutainment, PBD of late also, and I saw he attributed such to lukewarmness. Let me sound a little bit cynical here. I've been to many churches in Canada. I grew up in Nigeria. The expression of the Christian faith is actually quite different compared to here. I don't want to say one is better than the other, but I would say the problems plaguing the church is different here versus there. There's more of problems with everyone wants to blow up in a day, more like an artist who's just expecting to have a viral moment. People want their own viral moment in church. In those kind of environment, everyone wants to prosper and become exceedingly rich and, oppress everybody. But the problem here is actually, like you said, more of lukewarmness, more of inclusivity. Let's just be inclusive culture, because that's what the secular culture has created, and it has crept into the church. But I think the model we've created in church also is a kind of a woeful one. Let me use some churchian language here. If I go into any church right now in Ontario, I can almost predict what my experience is going to be like. It's going to be a 15-20 minute song or worship session. And then the pastor is going to come up and make some announcement, or maybe some deaconess in church or one of the leaders will make some announcement. 35 minutes of sermon, super scripted, almost a PowerPoint slide sort of thing presented to the church, hand-picked, cherry-picked scriptures kind of to help people get through the week in quote.
Mhm.
And then one more song by the worship team, and that's it. Kiri, no matter where you turn, that is what you get. And as soon as you walk through the door as a first timer in the church, the comment often from the pulpit is, whoever you are, there are no expectations of you today, but if you want to be a part of us, there's a place for you here to serve. What are we talking about when we're talking about the place to serve? We're talking about, come do a little bit of some evangelism work, in quote, come serve coffee, come do this, come do that. And I look at that, and a lot of times it sounds to me like a multi-level kind of marketing.
Right.
And I'm telling myself, is this the church model really? Are you telling me this was what I read about in the book of Acts? The early church that Paul talked about, rebuking one church after another, the Corinthian church, the Ephesian church, the Galatian church, talking about the Galatian church as you foolish Galatians. And I look at that model. One, like you said, it's lukewarm. But on the other hand, it sounds to me like a joke. And, I say this carefully. I say this carefully because I actually don't like saying it. I am a part of the church. I am a believer. So I don't stand externally to the church and begin to talk like I'm a consultant. Everybody has missed it. But it bothers me that the culture, the model we've created in church is a fluffy, multi-level marketing kind of scenario. We actually don't highlight the issue of everyone needs to be properly, thoroughly discipled, and not just discipled. I'll say one final thing. I know I'm talking too much here, Kiri. If you go back to the book of Exodus, which the Bible often talks about as the first church, the church in the wilderness, that was the way it was referred to later on in the book of Hebrews. I think Hebrews chapter 4 said that church, they perished in the wilderness because the word that they received did not mix with faith in their heart. That church, the experience is this. They complained every time, and God will hear them, God will provide for them, and they will move on. But in that church, the birth of that church happened actually almost right after Egypt. They walked through the Red Sea. And as they were walking through the Red Sea, the command that God gave Moses was that as they're walking through the Red Sea, command Israel, every tribe of Israel, let them pick stones from the depth of the Red Sea. You wonder why. Why do you want to belabor yourself with extra weight while crossing through a sea? Right? You just want to run through it as quickly as possible. One of the other things there is the fact that God told them that so that in the generations to come, when people ask you, when your children ask you, your children's children will ask you, then you will say, God actually led us through the Red Sea. Essentially, experiences matter here, and passing down this knowledge and this, permit me to say, encounters with the God of Israel matters here. But when I visit churches these days, that is actually not represented. What is represented is this multi-level marketing. It looks to me like, it's almost like, a Ponzi scheme that's bound to crumble.
Right.
And that's what we're experiencing right now.
Yeah, I think there's an identity crisis. I think that we have within church in general, especially in the West. I think we know what we want to have a genuine encounter experience with God, right? I think we want to do all the right things, but I think we struggle to figure out how to get there. And I think you hit on something there in terms of, going through the Red Sea, etc. This whole idea of remembering and active remembrance. One of the things that, I even see within the church landscape is that a lot of people are leaving the more Protestant kind of churches and going towards like transfer growth, almost like towards more historic expressions of church, whether it be the Catholic faith or even Eastern Orthodox faith, because there's often rhythms of active remembrance that are built in to a church service or the church and the church year, really, which I find fascinating because I think those methods of active remembrance, for example, even in communion, it's such an interesting topic in general, because it's that remembrance of Jesus' death, but also his resurrection, the active coming to partake in that. It's a very simple and yet profound encounter that brings your whole human self, holistically, body, soul, spirit, to encounter, eat from, engage with Jesus and go away changed. point. So what I'm trying to say is, I think in the West especially, we have an identity crisis. We don't know what to do. We've, like, the church often looks at the world and sees marketing, all that kind of stuff, right? Like, and therefore it's starting to reflect that, rather than being ones who reflect and engage with the active remembrance in a way that I think is a lot healthier. Not to say that anyone, does that perfectly, where we're imperfect, right? Of course there's going to be perfect, because we're imperfect people coming together, trying to do something together, which is always an interesting thing. But I think those active rhythms of remembrance are so huge. I'm even thinking this is not a new problem. This is a problem that we've had for such a long time. So, for example, one of the biggest historical threats that created secularization, really, right, that comes from the Enlightenment kind of thought. And in order to combat Enlightenment thought, what you started to have, like, within the church was a lot of, response, like tit for tat, right? If I'm going to give you all the reasons why I disbelieve now and get rid of God, I'm going to give you all the reasons that I do believe. And so the Christian faith, especially the neo-scholastic kind of Catholic Christian faith, like, it became very alike in its response. It almost mirrored. And I think we still have that problem with, here's our response to the world, right? Here's our mirroring of the world. But that's not going to change anything, right? You're just responding in kind and in light. You're not bringing the change, which is actually therefore going to change the world. People's responses, for example, in the Catholic Church mid-20th century was fascinating regarding this, because you had some really influential people that started to say, hey, you guys, we have lost, like, the Augustinians of the early church, like, sap. You've lost, like, the life of Jesus. You've lost this thing, right? And how is it that you've kind of fallen away from that? And what ended up happening, therefore, was that you got a lot of people who got kicked out of the Catholic Church. So I'm talking about people like Marie-Dominique Chenu, Henri de Lubac, like some of these really interesting people that about 10, 20 years later, they're being brought back and being like, oh, you guys had something. And that's what informed some of the Vatican II kind of like council. This whole idea that we need to go back and see what we've lost, right? So I think we've often lost that Augustinian sap. We've lost some of the goodness of the faith, as you said, like the Acts 2, like vibrant faith, where, we're struggling. We're in this living death, separated from the one who is life. Therefore, we need to connect to the one who is life, connect to that sap. We need to connect to God in this rhythmic, holistic, lived, embodied way. And that's the gospel, right? That's the truth. That's the way when there was no way, that I think can actually resonate with our current culture. That's the gospel that, and the lived reality that our culture needs, right? So, for example, in these discussions that we talked about, like within the world today, about people looking for help with trauma and some of these like different struggles, right? We're starting to realize in the secular world, hey, rhythms help. Those bodily embodied things help. Well, guess what? Like, Jesus has called us to a embodied, rhythmic, lived, holistic encounter to be holistically raised to life and resurrected to life. I think if we're able to see it, if we give ourselves the opportunity to see it, what we're invited to in the Christian faith is exactly what current culture is trying to look for. And maybe we've done a bad job of explaining and demonstrating that, because we've come along just mirrored, not shown the difference.
That's a very beautiful way to actually prefer some very good solution to that. And I think one of the work that you're doing in, I saw Soul Edge, which is what you're working on, I think alongside your husband. I think that's a very good place where people can reach out and connect with you and maybe continue this kind of conversation. Would you actually state how people can reach you directly?
You can reach me through, either the Soul Edge website at souledge.org, or just on Instagram. It's just my name, Kiri Jane Erb. Otherwise, I have a book coming out this summer, which really talks about how some of the rubber hits the road with, stuff like the death and resurrection of Jesus, how that impacts us, to do with time, trauma, reality, all that kind of good stuff. The name of that is Love, War, and the Mess in Between, and it's published by Whitford Stott. So look out for that, I guess.
That will be great. Hopefully we can reconnect when your book is out too. Just grab one for myself too. Yeah,
I'd love that. That'd be so much fun.
But yeah, I think it's a good place to wrap it up. Thank you very much, Kiri, for having this conversation with me. It's a real honor, actually. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. That's very sweet. It's been a joy. Thank you.
Revaluate is a project I embarked upon to spark meaningful conversations that can inspire critical thinking as we navigate the adventures of life. The analytics on this channel show about 95% of the viewers on the channel haven't subscribed yet. So you do me a favor by clicking the subscribe button right now. Then I'll keep my promise to continually improve on the quality of the conversations that are produced on this channel every time.